Hello and welcome one and all. You're listening to the very first Report It Now Global podcast, your window into the world of ethics and compliance. So happy to have you with us. I'm Jonathan Cotton, and today we're joined by the one and only Mary Shirley, a true leader in the field of ethics and compliance. She's the co-founder of the Great Women in Compliance podcast. She's co-author of Sending the Elevator Back Down, What We've Learned from Great Women in Compliance, and she's the author of Living Your Best Compliance Life. There's heaps to cover, so let's dive right in. Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. It really is a huge pleasure to have you on the show. Let's start at the beginning. How did you end up in the wild world of compliance?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it is such a pleasure to be here because I'm the very first guest, the inaugural Report It Now podcast guest. So what a special treat. Thank you for having me. I find introductions to be super boring, so I am going to breeze through this. I trained as a lawyer at Victoria University, and I worked for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner and the Commerce Commission in Wellington, and was an investigator at both of those government agencies before moving overseas to Singapore. And I ended up working in a telecommunications company where they really needed to put in place some good corporate governance. And my background, I think, was the closest of all the candidates that had applied, because compliance was relatively new in Singapore. This is around 2010. These days, it's much more mature, and I would consider Singapore to be a bit of a hub. And I was only supposed to be there for a couple of years, and decided that once I was out and about in the world, I kind of caught the travel bug. So unlike a lot of New Zealanders, I didn't originally have a plan on doing a big OE. I was content staying in Wellington, my hometown, for my whole life. And then, I just kind of went where the wind blew me. And it is, just nearing 15 years down the track, and 5 countries in terms of living places now.
Wow. So you're very well travelled. How would you say that international experience has shaped your approach to compliance?
I find it really useful in terms of considering the unique cultural practices around the world and how they might impact a compliance program. So, for example, some Kiwis might be aware that in many Asian cultures, it's typical to give red envelopes, and they would typically be given for things like Chinese New Year or gifts at a wedding, for example. What may be less familiar to us are white envelopes or gifts of cash at funerals. And it's always a little prickly talking about funerals. No one really loves to talk about the subject of death. But if you do not know about that topic, to train on that in a compliance training, because a lot of companies do not permit the giving and receiving of cash, even if it's within the cultural boundaries of the region, that can be problematic. And if you don't train your employees to that point, they will assume that it's okay because it is so embedded in their culture that compliance policies don't actually apply. So I have found that having exposure to other areas, there's certainly so much I still don't know, but having the opportunity to live in other places, it now allows me to remember to ask if I'm somewhere new where I haven't lived before and I'm doing a training there, hey, what are some of the festivals that are important to you, and what are some of the customs that go along with that, so I can understand what's typical from a giving benefit standpoint.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I suppose every culture has its own unique challenges that have to be sort of addressed on a case-by-case basis. That never would have even occurred to me.
That one's probably my favorite because I'm actually half Chinese myself, and I didn't know about that one until I was living and practicing compliance in Asia and really sort of living more amongst the culture. Having grown up in New Zealand, I grew up in a more Western culture. So I would suggest just one of the things to keep in mind is that we have grown up in a country where there isn't petty bribery. You know, we don't have police stopping us on the road for no reason, saying, "Hey, that was an infraction. You know, I'm going to fine you," or, you know, if you slip me $5, we can just let this slide. But a lot of our colleagues, and when we're in multinational corporations, they have grown up in societies like that. And so, what I have found pretty interesting is that you would think giving compliance training in a country like New Zealand or Australia would be pretty straightforward. But I actually have an easier time in countries where they've grown up with corruption. And the reason for that is that when I refer to bribery, for example, and the fact that we do business honestly, we don't pay bribes, to them it's like, oh, absolutely. But if to a New Zealander, it's, well, what do you mean we don't? I mean, I've never had to pay a bribe in my life. Why are we even talking about this? It's so far removed from our many of us, our everyday business practices, that people struggle to buy into compliance. Whereas in somewhere like, let's say, the Philippines, they'll be paying attention because it's relevant to them. They get it. So that's probably something that I found a little surprising, is that maybe it's going to be difficult to deal with my colleagues in Canada when it comes to compliance versus my colleagues in Brazil.
Interesting. Well, I guess, going a little bit further down that track, in terms of compliance maturity, especially in Australasia, you're in the US at the moment. How does the US compare to New Zealand in terms of, how far we are down that road?
This is pretty subjective, but I'd be inclined to say that the United States is probably the most mature of all jurisdictions in terms of compliance maturity. In Australia and New Zealand, we are a little bit trailing behind, and I don't say that with criticism. I think there's a very good reason for it, which is that while there are a lot of issues that are problematic from a misconduct standpoint, such as things like insider trading, competition law, fraud, other sort of white collar crimes, a big part of the compliance space has traditionally been the avoidance of bribery and corruption. And so we tend to see those things less in countries like New Zealand and Australia. And additionally, a lot of compliance issues are dealt with by big business. And so we tend to see a lot of large multinational corporations in other areas of the world. So New Zealand and Australia don't have as many, not that we don't have any at all, but we don't have as many big, like Fortune 500 companies. And we don't tend to see New Zealand and Australia as the regional hub for Asia Pacific as much as we tend to see places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai, for example. So that, in my mind at least, has been some of the reason why New Zealand and Australia have not necessarily been keeping at the same pace. And I think that's probably been fairly proportionate. However, low risk doesn't equal no risk. And for organizations that operate in New Zealand and Australia, whether they be branches of multinational corporations or whether they be domestic or region-specific companies, there is still risk. And a really interesting term that I came across a few years ago was pink-collar crime. Pink-collar crime tends to occur in situations where it's a smaller organization, less money is embezzled from the organization, and it tends to be in situations where someone is in a position of trust and there aren't a lot of internal controls governing their actions and activities. And so interestingly, one of the ways in which pink collar crime is often uncovered is when that sole person, who perhaps is the bookkeeper at a small family run business, goes on holiday and someone else takes over, and then they're able to see, wait a second, something's not right here with what they've been doing. So New Zealand and Australia, I would suggest, are very susceptible to pink collar crime, smaller types of misconduct and illegality, such as misappropriation of funds from really small businesses.
Okay, well, just before we sort of move on to, ideas around closing the gap, just while we're on the subject, it's not just culture that we're talking about, though, here, is it? 'Cause, there's legislative frameworks in place. How do they change approaches and the outcomes that we see in compliance?
Yeah. So bribery is a crime everywhere. We also don't like people stealing money from us in New Zealand. The reason I think why there is a gap is that the by far and away the largest enforcement activity comes from the United States. So we tend to see multinational corporations that have some nexus to the United States. So if you're listed on a US stock exchange, for example, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is going to apply. And so a lot of companies are nervous and concerned about that. We see whopping fines in that space. I'm talking several hundred million US dollars is entirely possible. So I think that's a large part of the sort of more buzzing activity that we tend to see. And it's not just American companies. A lot of European companies have concerns about their FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act exposure as well. So that's why there's a big difference in people caring about bribery as such there. What I've noticed in the last several years is an increase in the number of compliance roles advertised and available in Australia and New Zealand, and I would say Australia in particular. So it's tended to start out with financial services, which is not surprising, highly regulated. A lot of banks in Australia started putting in place local compliance officers, regional representatives there. I'm seeing more in the life sciences space, so pharmaceuticals, medical device, biotech type organizations are putting in more staff. And just recently I commented on a New Zealander's post saying I'm so excited to see more compliance roles really being embedded into New Zealand business, because it's not just about bribery, it's about good corporate governance, and what we'll talk a little bit later about some of the tangible benefits that companies see when they adhere to an ethical culture.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, Mary. So, talking a little bit about sort of where the rubber hits the road a little bit more, for the listeners out there here in New Zealand, in Australia, and around the world, generally speaking, what's the work to be done? What are the issues that compliance officers are facing, and where should we be trying to get to, looking down the road a year, 2 years, 3 years?
So the ideal would be to be able to say, I have a robust and defensible compliance program. And that's going to be proportionate based on your risk exposure, the size of your organization, the types of third parties that you deal with. So what it looks like for one company might be a little bit different from what it looks like at another. So somewhere like maybe a retail organization that sells clothing, that might focus a lot on risks which come from supply chain resilience. So ensuring lack of modern slavery, forced labor in the supply chain. An organization like the current company that I'm with in the life sciences space, very heavily regulated. We're going to try and avoid paying kickbacks or bribes to doctors at hospitals that we want to sell to. So whatever your risk profile is, you're going to be identifying what are the risks that are most critical to us, and what are the controls and procedures, the guardrails that we can put in place to mitigate those risks. And once you have decided on some of those things, typically the first thing to do is a risk assessment, which is an activity around identifying the risks that you have and scoring them in terms of the impact and the likelihood that they might have if they eventuate. And based on that, you're better able to take those priorities, those subject area priorities that you've identified, and figure out some of the steps that you're going to take, because there's a lot to be done, and it's very much the Rome wasn't built in a day kind of thing. So when you're rolling out a compliance program, you just focus bit by bit on the important things that have been identified to you in a risk assessment.
Yeah, it's not a one and done type thing, is it? It's definitely a journey.
For sure. It would take, for an organization starting from scratch, it would not be unusual to take maybe 2 to 3 years to build out a robust and defensible compliance program in terms of being able to say that you've got all of the elements in place.
Great. Okay. So say you're starting on this journey, you're coming into a company that's been letting the compliance side of the organization slide for a while. What are the landmarks that you want to focus on? What do you want to aim for so that you know that real progress is being made rather than just, a document here, an email there? What is it that really matters?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to have a dedicated compliance person. A team would be even better, but I want to be really conscious of the fact that, not all New Zealand companies are like the equivalent of, say, a Starbucks, where there's just crazy amounts of money to do things. So let's say that you have the ability to take maybe one FTE and give them an opportunity to learn about compliance as part of their role. So maybe they become zero point 0.5 of a compliance FTE. And we saw this quite a lot when compliance came to be in the United States. So it started out a lot of the time with people who were traditionally lawyers, would be sort of transitioned into compliance roles, but it wasn't unusual either to see HR professionals also get the compliance hat. I'm a big fan of people with internal audit backgrounds coming into compliance, but there are all sorts of backgrounds that are very successful compliance officers. So a couple of my friends in the space who are chief compliance officers, one is like a physical therapist by training, another is a registered nurse, and they work in healthcare compliance. So actually quite a useful background to have when you're able to really connect with the business as a professional first. So identifying some resource and ideally budget to make sure that you're not sending that person on a glass cliff exercise. You don't want to set them up to fail. And not only are they going to need resources, but guidance from the United States specifically has been about good compliance programs are ones where staff are adequately staffed and resourced. So, giving them budget and tools to be able to do their job properly. I'd say that would be the absolute first strong step towards implementing a compliance program. The next thing would be having that person conduct a risk assessment, and you don't necessarily need to get an external consultancy in to do that. There is a lot of material available freely on the internet these days, including things like podcasts like this, which give tips to people on how to go about conducting certain compliance activities. One of the key things, which is a little hard as a tangible measure, would be tone from the top, which is essentially getting your leadership and management to buy into compliance and show that they're committed to it as well and that they support it. In my opinion, that is the one thing that when you don't have that, it's very difficult to make your compliance program successful. And a lot of compliance officers, I think, have left their positions in companies because they haven't had that, and the compliance program isn't taken seriously. And everybody knows that within the organization. So that is such a critical thing to have. I'm not sure it fits the description of a milestone, but it is something that is key. And then in amongst that, you're going to be doing a couple of other things as well, which will be writing policies and procedures, ideally leveraging off a pre-existing code of conduct. I know many New Zealand organizations, certainly government departments from my time as a civil servant, already have these in place and already deal with typical compliance issues. Like I remember back in 2005, reading the code of conduct for the Department of Building and Housing at the time. No longer exists, or at least in its under the name it was back then. And I remember reading, if you receive a gift, you can't accept it. And naive, very young Mary was like, people are going to give me gifts. No one, as a civil servant, I never got any gifts at my level, certainly. So these types of things are already around for a lot of organizations. It's just a matter of leveraging them, leveling up a little bit. And if you don't have one, from a documentation standpoint, the code of conduct is going to be where you start. The code of conduct is the foundation of your compliance program. And finally, in terms of some of those key priority milestones, it's going to be something like a report it now, speak up system. So one of the critical things, and it's so important actually, that in companies that are subject to Sarbanes-Oxley, so publicly traded companies here, they must have a whistleblower avenue in place so that people can report misconduct. So that's one of the things where if I go into a company that doesn't have a very mature compliance program, I prioritize putting some effort and energy around not only implementing that, checking it works, but advertising the heck out of it, because people won't make any reports or express misconduct concerns if they don't know that you can, if they don't know how to do it, and if they don't know the contact details for being able to do so. So it's really important that if you already have a hotline, fantastic, or a means to report concerns. And ideally, this is going to be more than just a suggestion box outside the CEO's office. We have to be a little bit more leveled up and sophisticated these days. If you already have one and you've advertised it in the past, or you may even still have posters up in the kitchen, do a fresh set, because when you have posters up or release communication, it kind of blends into the furniture after a while. So when I worked on the consultancy side of compliance, one of my clients was revisiting their Speak Up initiatives. They already had a hotline in place, but they redid their communications, and they saw an almost 30% uptick in the number of calls coming through to the hotline.
It needs to be kept fresh, doesn't it, to keep it front of mind? Okay, let's just change tack a little bit here. Okay, when we're thinking about companies who do this really, really well, in the top percentile, what is it that makes them special? What do the really successful companies do that others can learn from?
I'm going to tell you a secret here. It is a common misperception in companies that do not have a mature compliance program that they assume if there aren't very many reports of misconduct being made, that means that they have an ethical culture. That
no news is good news, right?
Exactly. And sometimes in some parts of our lives, that is in fact the case, not when it comes to a compliance program. So it is actually viewed as a positive to have multiple calls coming through your hotline. They may not all be substantiated. They may not all be found to be actual issues, but you want to have a lot of contact, a lot of people reaching out to say, hey, I think this is suspicious. I want to tell you about it. And so it's almost like the more calls that you have, there's some positive signaling out of that. And so it is that people trust your systems and your processes, right? Like the fact that they're bothering to call means they think that you're going to do something about it. So that's one of the things that I tend to see differently with companies with fantastic cultures. They embrace people making reports, they encourage them. And I think that's a critical thing where, we're sometimes scared about rocking the boat. And so people sort of think it's not a good idea to encourage. And so what you want to do is get your management on board, because if we sweep something under the rug, that doesn't make the issue go away. And in fact, if people don't feel heard, they're going to end up going to sources that we don't like the media, social media, a government agency, and then we lose complete control over addressing the issue ourselves. So we want to encourage people speaking up. We want to encourage our managers telling their people that they should speak up. And we want to encourage our managers and train them on how they can receive reports that come through to them directly instead of the hotline. So from a statistics standpoint, when it comes to making reports, we tend to see that when people want to report misconduct, they will more often report internally to somebody that they know versus calling an independent hotline. Now, there is a huge amount of value in having an independent hotline, but it's also a really great metric to be able to compare the number of reports that are coming through to your people versus the independent hotline. And it's also another interesting metric to see the number of reports made anonymously versus where the person will reveal their identity. Again, that shows some psychological safety, trust in your system. We see that as a plus.
Great. Okay, so why don't we just take a moment to talk about the technology side of things? So why is technology important in robust compliance programs? Why is it worth your time to investigate, and why is it worth investment?
Well, frankly, it just makes our lives so much easier. I remember being a compliance officer in 2010 versus now. There was like a whole lot less available from vendors to help us at the time, especially when it came to tech. And tech plays a very large role, frankly. There is an expectation that we do data analytics and leverage that to improve and enhance our compliance programs. And a lot of the technology, so when there are systems like Report It Now that enable us to do case management and look at trends over time, that's a really easy way to deploy data analytics and grow and advance your compliance program based on the knowledge that you gain, that it is carefully collecting and helping you to analyze.
Yeah, beautifully put, Mary. Okay, just quickly, what advice do you have for Australasian organisations looking to get their compliance obligations sorted?
Yep.
What are the quick wins they can easily tick off, and how do they set themselves up for long-term success in an environment where regulatory change is bound to happen sooner or later?
Great question. So what I would do is have conversations with some of my peers at similar organizations that have a similar demographic and profile, ask them what they're thinking about, what they're doing on their compliance standpoint. One of the great things about compliance is that it's quite difficult for us to run into any competition law issues. So it's sort of a safe space to be able to talk with competitors about compliance programs, but you can also talk to your friends at other companies as well. Like if you happen to know that a friend works at like a very famous Fortune 500 company, they're much more likely to have an established compliance function in place. And so learn a little bit about, what are some of the hallmarks of your compliance program, what's been successful there. Look into the literature. So start reading up on things. A couple of key documents that I would suggest would be the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs Guidance, which is a Department of Justice document out of the United States. That is one of the closest documents, if not that's the one thing in my mind that if you read nothing else, you would have a really strong understanding as to what a compliance program is by the end of reading that. And then there's a similar document out of the UK issued by the Ministry of Justice. And it talks about their recommendations, their principles for a good compliance program as well. So start out by reading those documents, chatting with your counterparts, or even just like at the next barbecue you're at, just sort of casually sort of do a straw poll, like, hey, who here works for a company that's got a compliance function? I'm kind of curious as to, what we should be doing, and see whether, they're able to speak to that or not. I would suggest typically you would find that the bigger, the more international the organization, the more likely. However, when I was on the vendor side in compliance, one of my clients was like a pretty small Australian, like very domestic company. And I think it only had maybe 27 staff. and they were already putting in place a pretty robust compliance program. So you may be pleasantly surprised by what your next door neighbor, what their organization is doing when it comes to compliance, but start, having a look around, ask yourself, does my organization already have a code of conduct? If so, wouldn't now be a nice time to start memorializing some of our shared values, some of our principles, some of the ways in which we consider it best to do business? This is a great opportunity to do that.
Hey, that's great advice, Mary. You make it sound easy. Hey, while we're on the subject of getting your reading done, now might be a good time to bring up your book, Living Your Best Compliance Life.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Well, tell me a little bit about what was the genesis of the book?
Well, I was thinking, there's a lot of ideas that are in my mind and that I know are in the minds of some of my colleagues about how we can take our compliance program to the next level, hence the concept of leveling up in there. So it's about trailblazing and innovative ideas to enhance and improve your compliance program.
Great. And where can people pick that up if they want to grab a copy?
Well, it's available on Amazon, and I think a couple of local sites in New Zealand have it now as well. So, and if you are a client of Craig's, he was very generous in terms of giving some of those out to some of his key stakeholders. So hopefully some of you listening have already got a copy courtesy of Report It Now.
That's right. Good stuff. Just while I've got you, Mary, one thing we haven't touched on is you were a co-founder of the Great Women in Compliance podcast. You must have seen a lot of evolution in the industry over the years. How has compliance changed?
Yeah, compliance is kind of interesting from a gender ratio standpoint in terms of the fact that it is not a male-dominated space. And so that's historically, I think, for quite some time been the case. What we tend to see a little bit, however, and this is a little disappointing for me, is that there's a study called Inside the Mind of the Chief Compliance Officer. And the study shows that while women are more educated in the field of compliance, they tend to earn less at the Chief Compliance Officer level than men. So there is still a little bit of work to be done when it comes to pay parity in the space. But one of the things that I've learned is that this is just such an open and helpful area. Like, I've reached out to strangers to ask them questions, get help, and they've just been so kind and generous with their time. So it's a really friendly area to be in. So if you've just been told, like voluntold, that you now have the compliance hat in your organization, I would say cheer up. It's actually a really wonderful community to be a part of. And if you're thinking about getting more involved in corporate governance, ethics, and compliance, I would strongly encourage it. I'm so happy to have found myself working in compliance. And for me, it's not just a 9 to 5. It's truly a place where I found my people and engage with the community. And I'm very, very happy doing the work that I do.
Yeah. What advice would you give to other compliance professionals that want to connect a little bit closer with that community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say start searching for compliance folks on LinkedIn. That's where I've met a lot of my contacts. People that were strangers have turned into friends through those connections. Try signing up to webinars. So you'll note that there are events like this happening where organizations put out webinars. Consider whether it might be possible to request budget to attend a conference somewhere else. There are certainly, I know, ones in Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong that you can go to. And of course, the United States has many as well, and certainly do get international attendees. I was at one in Amsterdam last year, and a Kiwi came up to me afterwards and introduced himself after I'd finished my speaking session. So We need to get amongst it, keep our skills up, keep networking with people. Don't be afraid to go out on a limb. A really easy way you can do that is, let's say you've seen an article that someone wrote and you really enjoyed it, it resonated, or you learned something from it. Reach out to the author, let them know that. So you're sending the elevator back down, but you're also making a connection. And think about doing that after you've seen people speak at webinars as well. Reach out to a speaker if they said something that you really enjoyed or found helpful. Let them know, make that new connection.
Good advice, Mary. And how can our listeners find out a little bit more about your work and get connected?
Sure. Well, I have a web page on a compliance media site called Corporate Compliance Insights, and you can find information there, including my articles. Many of the articles that I publish go through that site. So that's a good place, and you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn as well.
Good stuff. There you have it, folks. The very first episode of the Report It Now Global Podcast in the bag. Big thank you to our guest, Mary Shirley, and a big thanks to you for tuning in. If you like what you've heard here, please hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, or criticisms you've got. Your feedback is always very much appreciated. Or if you've got a suggestion for a future guest, please let us know. That's it from us. Till next time, I'm Jonathan Cotton. This was the Report It Now Global Podcast. Thank you for being a part of it. Catch you next time.